Hey everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with a special report on the battle for clean elections. Judicial Watch, once again, is right in the middle of it with several lawsuits to make sure your votes are counted and that our elections are as clean as possible, not only in 2020 but beyond. We have several pieces of litigation on it, and we've been front and center with testimony by yours truly to Congress. Leading our legal fight is Bob Popper, who's joining me today. He's a senior attorney with Judicial Watch, who's been leading our election integrity initiative for several years now. I forget how long you've been there, but longer than I probably will remember or that you care to admit to. But Bob's had tremendous success in his legal team in making sure election rolls are cleaned according to the law, federal law. And obviously that's become a much more important issue in light of the less efforts to really blow up our elections by flooding the mails with millions of ballots. So we've got litigation on that in California and cases, new cases in Pennsylvania and North Carolina we want to tell you about. Just a lot going on, and I thought it was important that we provide you, our supporters, an update as to where things stand and what else we need to do to ensure that our elections aren't stolen improperly, frankly, in 2020 and beyond. So with that, I'll bring in Bob. Bob, thanks for joining us. I appreciate you.
Good to see you, Tom. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. We're doing the Zoom interview today. Well, which leads to the next question. You know, are we being scared into not voting in person as because of coronavirus, and is that being used and abused by the left to change our election systems at the last minute?
Well, if I had to give a short answer, it would be yes and yes. You raised a very interesting point in your testimony to Congress when you pointed out that to exaggerate the extent to which coronavirus does or ought to keep people from voting or should make them concerned about showing up and voting in person was its own form of voter suppression. Unless, and to the extent that it's true, but if you're exaggerating it, you're suppressing votes. And I mean, what we've seen is a lot of efforts to push vote by mail for what I consider to be partisan purposes and not for purposes that are consistent with health reasons. As you know, Tom, we've sued in California, and they have, the governor there issued an executive order mandating vote by mail, and his initial order mandated that ballots be sent to everyone, including the millions of California inactive voters. Now, because of our suit, he subsequently changed that. We also said that the legislature had to pass that kind of a law. The governor can't do that. Because of our suit, the legislature now has passed such a law. The governor still has not withdrawn his order, but we've made an awful lot of progress there. And sort of the sting in the tail of this story is that while the justification for that executive order and now for the law has been health concerns, the state of California still won't modify or rescind its ballot harvesting statute, which allows people to go door to door, strangers, and knock on people's door and help them fill out their ballots. And if health were the only concern, you would think that would be modified. The state has refused to do that.
Well, but the fact that they're going to be mailing, I mean, I've seen numbers upwards of 20 million ballots, putting that into the mail system. I mean, I know there are inactive names that shouldn't be getting the ballots to begin with. It's frankly an open question as to whether they still will. But it doesn't mean the lists are clean and perfect as anyway. So they could just wall off the inactives and still create an unholy mess by flooding the system with mail ballots. I mean, we've seen this in New Jersey, for instance, where they've been. I mean, anyone who's been tracking this issue has gotten story after story about multiple ballot applications or ballots being mailed to addresses and addressees that no longer are there or shouldn't be getting them.
Yeah, there's two issues there, and you've identified them both. One is just the mess that's created, whether or not you intend it, and the second is the possibility of fraud. Now, with respect to ballots, even when you're trying not to, or, there's no intention to create fraud. If you take a state like California that hasn't applied, as we learned, the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act, which requires it to clean up its voter rolls, hasn't applied it in 20 years. That doesn't just mean that there are too many inactive registrations in California. That means that a lot of the active registrations ought not to be active. They should have, prior to today, received a notice letter that identified them as somebody who needs to tell the state whether they still live there. And so it's everyone in the state whose rolls or whose registrations become more open to question. Now, with respect to voter fraud, I mean, one thing that I've been very amused to witness during the pandemic, to the extent that anything's amusing during the pandemic, but it used to be the case when the arguments were all over voter ID, that you would hear the argument that, look, fraud has nothing to do with voter ID, and no one's going to show up and impersonate someone else, although that does happen. No one's going to do that. As all the experts will tell you, all the fraud concerns absentee ballots. Well, now that we're talking about COVID-19 and using absentee ballots, suddenly the same argument, the same talking points have shifted, and now it's suddenly absentee ballots that are all right. Well, no, there are risks with absentee ballots, as we see in Paterson, New Jersey, where we see.
Well, it's just common sense, isn't it? It's just common sense. When you vote in person, you have privacy. You're voting in a place controlled by the government, so you have protection. Mm-hmm. And when you take the vote away from that place and you are voting anywhere else, you are susceptible to pressure, intimidation. Your vote can be intercepted on the way to you or on the way away, or before it gets back to the polling place.
As has been pointed out by a number of commentators, when you have absentee voting outside of the purview of the government, you can enforce contracts to purchase votes, illegal contracts. They become enforceable because the voting is taking place outside of government monitoring. It just makes sense that there are protections that exist when you vote in person that don't exist when you're voting by mail. If you walk in to a ballot polling site and you intend to impersonate someone else and steal their vote, it takes a bit of guts. The poll worker may spot you and say, I know Jim Smith, you're not Jim Smith, or someone else in line may say that. You're sticking your neck out. But if you're at home and all you're doing is filling out someone else's ballot and forging a signature, you're not even putting your own name. No one's ever going to find that out. The risks are lower, and so the lengths to which people are willing to go are greater. And so we've got common sense looking at incentives.
I mean, we've got a settlement in California. Los Angeles County has agreed to remove up to 1.6 million names from the rolls. In Kentucky, we have a consent decree, at least 250,000 names to be removed from the rolls there, maybe upwards of 500,000. And we did a study last year that showed 2.5 million names extra on the rolls. What protections are going to be in place to make sure the rolls are only those getting and only those eligible are getting the ballots, and then on the back end, what processes are in place to make sure that there's no voter fraud once the ballots go out?
Yeah, and I mean, both of those are true, but there's all kinds of unintended consequences. I mean, there was a recent study in California, and it carries a lot of weight with me because it was commenced before COVID-19. And they were looking at absentee ballots, and you send them in and you have a signature and you have a person, an employee with the government who checks the signature. And that person doesn't have any special training. They're not with the FBI. They look at a signature and they go, yeah, it's the same. No, it's not. And something like 1/4 of the ballots that were rejected in the elections that they studied in that study were rejected because some untrained person said that doesn't look like the same signature. If you want to expand voter access, there are unintended consequences you really want to think about. It's not just a question of fraud.
So you got two issues here. You've got the left, specifically Stacey Abrams, who has gone overboard here. Stacey Abrams is this failed candidate for governor who's speciously argued that your election was stolen from her and is suggesting that people shouldn't have to choose between voting and dying. So that's scaring people from showing up at the polls, which,
Yes.
And any normal person should see that it's safe to vote. You can go shopping, and for food, you should be able to go and vote safely. But secondly, you're suggesting if you want votes to be assuredly counted, vote by mail isn't the way to do it, or it's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is show up. It's harder to destroy your vote and not have your vote counted if you're voting in person as opposed to by mail.
Well, you may also be disenfranchised. Some person who makes a decision about what your signature ought to look like decides it's not you and tosses your ballot.
Now, in theory, you can challenge that, but that's another hurdle.
Exactly, and in practice, it won't be challenged. But I think it's.
Hold on a second. I mean, this sounds like the train has left the station. I mean, California, unless we figure out another way to stop it, is going to destroy the elections in California with, in my view, chaos and fraud by mailing 20 million ballots. Other states are increasing the availability of mail-in ballots. Here in the District of Columbia, they're mailing everyone a ballot. I mean, it sounds to me like on election day, we're inviting chaos.
Well, we may be, but just know that not everything is going the way that the California legislature would have it go. And, never let anyone watching this video forget that they're still allowing people to go door to door, knocking on doors to collect ballots and to help people fill them out. And how that's consistent with a concern for health, someone needs to explain to me. But
there'll be 20 million ballots there in California, and all of these activists, most of whom will be working for the left, the Republicans, in theory, will be doing something.
Be working for the state employees union, who are the people who inspired the passage of the law in the first place.
So mostly union activists, partisans, will go in, and they know there are these millions of ballots out there for them to basically cull, C-U-L-L.
Yeah.
What a threat to our republic in terms of clean and fair elections. There's been nothing like it in American history, certainly not in that state, in California, in terms of an uncontrolled election process.
That's right, but I wanted to make the point that it's not all going the way that the California legislature or Governor Newsom would prefer. In Texas, the Supreme Court declined to reverse a stay of a district court's order, and just cutting through the legalese.
Right.
The district court had ruled that vote by mail was a constitutional requirement, and that opinion got smacked down by a unanimous Fifth Circuit in a very cutting opinion, suggesting that that was obviously going too far. And the Supreme Court sided basically with the Fifth Circuit. And, that claim that the Constitution requires, that safety requires the ability to vote by mail was struck down. And the Trump administration is also sued in Pennsylvania, and on much the same grounds with many of the same arguments. It is an open question. The fight is happening now.
Right.
But just to say that you have to choose between voting and living is irresponsible. I mean, I went out this morning and got bagels. I mean, was I choosing death when I chose bagels? I mean,
Well, what kind of bagel did you buy? It depends.
Well, cinnamon raisin. Okay. Now my son likes those horrible everything bagels, but
right.
It's a little off topic. But my point is simply that, to tell people that you're risking your life to vote when there's going to be social distancing, when there's going to be the lines, when people are going to be wearing masks, when the poll workers are going to be wearing masks, just as they were at the retail outlets around where I live, it's not responsible. And, but I think that's something you might expect from someone like Stacey Abrams, who clearly lost an election by tens of thousands of votes and is suggesting that she didn't. But we need to consistently apply and speak scientifically, and I don't think that that is.
The big issue is obviously with the vote by mail is the fact the lists are dirty. I mean, that's the kind of prima facie evidence that there'll be a fraud, a significant fraud risk. So California settled. They've admitted there are 1.5 extra million names on the rolls, upwards of 1.5 million extra names. Now we've got new litigation in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and I think between those two states, we're alleging there's nearly 2 million extra names on the rolls there. What it seems to me here is that, we do this surface analysis last year that shows 2.5 million nationally. Then we do a deep dive in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and boom, we find maybe 2 million names in just 2 states alone. Are we underestimating the amount of bad names on the rolls here?
You may be a little bit, because bear in mind, there's inactive registrations where there might be tens of millions in the United States. And then the 2.5 million, those are inactive registrations in states or counties that have 100% registration rates. So that's the elite. That's the top of Mount Everest. And
right. So when we say 2.5 million extra names, that's just a very conservative, cautious estimate, being very
absolutely right
to the counties. Right.
Absolutely right, because those are counties and states that have more than 100% registration when you look at the number of citizens over the age of 18 that live in those counties and states. And so you're just counting, the very top of that list. I will tell you as a voting litigation practitioner that if you have a registration rate of 97%, 98%, 95%, you might want to consider whether you are in fact removing all the registrations of people who've died or have moved out of state. 100, it's not just 100%, but that's perhaps.
Yeah, look, Judicial Watch, if you're a supporter of Judicial Watch, you get a lot of mail. And we obviously have a financial interest in making sure you don't get duplicate mailings. And we're always battling to make sure that we're not getting duplicates out. And despite that, we still send out duplicates now and again. And we're not the government. So you can imagine
I would put it this way. If you were trying to send Judicial Watch mailings to people who really lived where we think they live, you would do much, much better using Judicial Watch's list than you would using a government voter list, particularly in California or in North Carolina or in Pennsylvania. Our list, as flawed as it may be, we're talking about widespread flaws when it comes to voter rolls.
Yeah, the private sector is much more efficient at figuring out where people live and tracking them when they move. And of course, the government doesn't avail themselves too often of that private sector expertise. But of course, we've got these lawsuits. We sued Newsom on behalf of Darrell Issa, a candidate, and other voters, independent, Democrat, and otherwise, to try to curtail those abuses there with the mail-in ballots. We're suing in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. What I think our supporters and viewers will be interested to learn is that it's not just us versus the states. It's not just us against the elected officials, that the left and the Democratic Party have been trying to, and in some cases successfully, intervening to defend the indefensible here.
Well, that's true. Look, they have offensive litigation, like the lawsuit where they said that vote by mail in Texas was a constitutional requirement, and that ultimately was stayed, and it looks like a very flawed decision, but they obtained that. And then they're also coming in to Pennsylvania and North Carolina, and when we were in California, they tried to intervene, and they're trying to come in and say that they want to represent the state, so to speak, on the theory that the state can't represent itself well enough. And what they want to do then is to make all of the arguments that the state would probably consider beyond the pale, and to press them in the lawsuit that we commenced. That's right. And we're continually being barraged with requests and motions to join our lawsuits, the lawsuits that we started as plaintiffs, by left-wing outfits that want to derail what it is we're trying to do.
And we don't do this for partisan purposes. We're just trying to get the rule of law enforced here. What I thought was interesting, though, is that in California, the Democratic Party came in and said that our success is contingent on this mail-in ballot scheme proceeding. I mean, they admitted that they thought they would do better if they sent out 20 million ballots through the mails. Isn't that an interesting perspective to take?
Yes, you certainly could read it that way. Yes, I mean it's like the example I keep coming back to about ballot harvesting, which is perceived to favor one party, and guess what? We still have it. But I to your point about us being nonpartisan, look, we sued Kentucky and won a consent judgment over their voter rolls, and that's Trump territory, and that's
The Republican mess down there.
yeah, and for us, voter rolls are voter rolls, and they ought to be cleaned, and we're willing to devote resources and have our lawyers spend their time suing and pursuing lawsuits.
So we've got the litigation in Pennsylvania. We're facing in North Carolina. We're facing intervention from the left. I heard a stat this morning that the left has filed over 100 lawsuits to try to upend our election processes just in the last several months to a year.
I hadn't heard that. I absolutely believe it. That sounds about right. But there's tens of millions of dollars floating around from philanthropists who want this to happen and who really want a lack of integrity insofar as it's perceived to help one of the parties. And they don't care about federal law. They don't care except about those parts that favor the agenda of those who think that election rules can be bent to help them. And the consequentialism of it is astonishing. The extent to which any voter practice or rule is favored or disfavored based on whether it helps or hurts one party. I mean, there was a movement a couple of years ago to indulge in early voting. And, if 2 weeks of early voting was good, the argument went, well, 4 weeks is better and 6 weeks is the best, and federal courts were signing on to this. And then people started to do studies, and they realized from these studies that, in fact, they don't increase turnout. And suddenly the movement for early voting has been, put on the shelf. They don't increase Democratic turnout in particular. And so suddenly there's less interest in it. And you tell me why that is.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's why it's important to have Judicial Watch as an independent entity doing this, because who knows, the Republicans may at one time think, oh, well, we like mail-in voting. We don't care about the risk of fraud. We think we get a political benefit from it. And if, people have their civil rights violated, or we'll harvest the heck of the votes in California too and just deal with it, and we won't care about the civil rights of the voters. That's why you need independent entities here to be willing to go in and sue over these issues. I think, and to that end, one of the big lies out there, and this is a Republican and Democrat problem, is that absentee balloting arguably is too widely available as it is. And in many states, I think it's 33 or so, you can vote absentee without having to have any reason for doing so.
That is the new trend.
Excuse.
That is the new law. Yes, that's becoming much more accepted. I mean, there was a time when in order to vote absentee, you had to be out of the state, you had to be sick, the people who could deliver the ballots, this was in California before they amended their law in 2016. You had to be a housemate, you had to be a family member, you had to have a reason. In various states, you had to, sometimes certify to the reason. You had to identify the people who were dropping off ballots. All that's falling by the wayside. I mean, it's starting to be so that the delivery of ballots is not much different than online voting. And with each one of these steps, protections fall by the wayside. And you're exactly right. Both parties will favor whatever procedures their tech people, their advisors, their experience tells them favors them. And they don't care about the integrity aspects. Once there's a conflict.
But there are a few states that do have security requirements tied to absentee balloting, such as ID requirements and things like that, where you need a legit excuse. And of course, that's the goal of this national legislation by the left, and certainly the state-by-state challenges, is to undermine the modest security measures that the 15 or 16 states that have them are still trying to maintain.
Yes. Well, we just put our head down and we look for bad voter rolls, and we go and we demand that they be fixed. Okay, but the partisanship is every bit as you've described, and my favorite example, partisan management of the voting rules. And it comes out of Virginia, and it's Governor Terry McAuliffe. And it was when he vetoed a bill that would have simply required that poll books contain a photograph of each voter, the photograph that they sat for voluntarily when they went and got their driver's license and then registered to vote. What can possibly be discriminatory about the photograph that you sat for when you got your driver's license?
Well,
why do you veto that bill? And yet he did. And yet
well, look, this is my view. You oppose voter ID, you oppose citizenship verification, which is something no one else wants to talk about, even Republicans. You want the list to be dirty. You want people to kind of be able to game the system easily without being checked through ballot harvesting or same-day registration, where you just show up and vote, no questions asked.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that means you want to be able to see elections when necessary. And when you are trying to change our nation's election system, literally at the last minute, the fact that we are not having a popular and media uproar in reaction to that, I fear for the future of the republic in terms of being able to have elections that we can count on as being accurate. My view is that you got elections nationally, at least at the presidential level. Generally, who won or lost. The numbers in the end may not be accurate, but they're a pretty good approximation of what the outcome actually was. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. We're going to be able to rely on elections to be an accurate representation of the true winner anymore under these systems.
Well, you have the underlying sanity of the American people who, notwithstanding a barrage of studies and media reports and a blatant attempt to flip the burden of proof, show me there is fraud. Really, when you pass a law against securities fraud, you say, well, show me there's securities fraud? No, you assume that people, when there's money, when there's interest at stake, are going to try to cheat because we're human. All right. And you start with that assumption, and then you want things to be as clean as possible. But the American people, they're not buying it. In poll after poll, to the present day, they favor voter ID, Democrats and Republicans.
So as best as I can tell, the voter ID laws are non-existent in 15 states and the District of Columbia, like big states like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, California. Only 10 or 11 states have strict voter ID laws. So my point being that you probably, if you're listening to this, either live in a state that has no voter ID, or if you think there's voter ID, it's not as strong as it ought to be. Am I correct on that?
Easily overcome. Yes, there's a lot of states like that. I mean, as you know, Tom, when we go to vote in Maryland, they ostentatiously make a point that they're not asking us for ID. It's at least the poll workers I've seen sort of emphasize that point and like to revel in it. Yeah, and this is something where the rest of the world thinks that we're odd. And I just, how to put this? In Northern Ireland, in the mid-90s, there was an epidemic of impersonation fraud. It can happen, and they passed laws in order to deal with that epidemic. Okay, just because you're not having a problem now doesn't mean you shouldn't have the protections that make someone just look at a system and say, it's honest. It's fundamentally honest. And Americans don't think it is. And I think they're onto something. Just in poll after poll, Americans say that they don't trust their electoral system.
So we've got two lawsuits in in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Those are proceeding. We've got our lawsuit in California, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to work in the end. Depends if Newsom actually commits to following, again, the law. But we're facing a threat to clean elections in California. And people should remember, it's not just about the presidential race. Down ballot, congressional race, Senate races, races for your city council, your town council, your board of elections. I mean, that's, when you talk about voter fraud, that's where the temptation becomes much greater because A, there's less attention paid to the lower races, and B, those people have a tremendous incentive because the return on the fraud is much higher because the numbers are smaller.
Yeah, well, the numbers are smaller. I would call that C, which is you have much more of a likelihood that you're going to affect the outcome. You're not going to affect the outcome, in the voting in California, but you certainly could affect the outcome in the voting in a small down market, down ballot election in California.
So, Bob, what can everyday, obviously, in addition to supporting Judicial Watch, and I want to reaffirm this, Judicial Watch, and I can think of two or three, literally two other groups right now who are doing this regularly, trying to stand for clean elections. No one's doing the broad work that we're doing, at least in the nonprofit sector. The Republicans are suing here and there. The Justice Department is completely AWOL on these issues. So Judicial Watch is doing, again, all the heavy lifting on this, practically speaking, or much of it. So citizens should support our work, obviously, but what can they do in terms of individual activism on these election integrity issues?
Well, pay attention and, think hard about what people are telling you. And when they tell you that, there's very little evidence of fraud, I mean, try to think about, is it the kind of fraud like absentee fraud where you're never going to catch the person anyway? Because even then, they did manage to catch them in Paterson, New Jersey. But, isn't voting fraud the kind of fraud that is easier to get away with? Is it something where the penalties are lower? Is it something where the resources devoted are lower? I mean, just listen with information and attention to what people are telling you, and question what you think is questionable. And just continue. Don't become numb. Continue to engage in the information that you're hearing and continue to follow your instincts. I mean, if you think people are likely to cheat, they probably are.
Well, I mean, if you're, for instance, at your home getting multiple ballots for people who don't live there for yourself, call the elections board, call your local officials, let them know. If you move, make sure that your name still isn't on the list in the state you're moving from, or even, frankly, the location you're moving from, because if you move within the state, you could be double registered on the state rolls again, depending if you re-register in another location in the state. So
yes, and you certainly can, as you're pointing out, you can have a hand in cleaning up the voter rolls as they pertain to your household. I mean, we receive at Judicial Watch so many notifications from people who say, my mother died 10 years ago. I got her ballot today. My brother moved out of town, moved out of state 8 years ago. I still get his ballot. I mean, someone at Judicial Watch got a ballot from Michigan 10 years after the last time she set foot in that state. For something like that, keep after the public and local officials and make them remove those registrations, because every one of them is potential trouble. And to the extent that you can cause, we can get enough people to do that, you can make a difference.
Well, and certainly carefully analyze changes to voting laws with keeping in mind the concerns we're raising about expanding vote by mail, securing the vote with vote ID, and of course the elephant in the room, the fact we have tens of millions of aliens present in the United States who easily can register to vote, and the only way we make sure they're not voting or not registering to vote is relying on them crossing their hearts and promising that they're not aliens when they register to vote. There's no checking of that.
You've hit another area that relates directly to the good intentions or the partisan intentions of the parties when it comes to voting rules, and that concerns non-citizens. I mean, we actually saw a lawsuit that was ultimately successful, preventing there from being a question on the citizenship form about, I'm sorry, on the census form about whether the person being queried was a United States citizen. And of course, you can only vote if you're a United States citizen in US elections. Why do you block that? Why do you prevent that question being asked? You know, and I've heard the theories about how it might be used for bad purposes or it might scare people, and none of them were persuasive. I mean, if we can get information from that kind of massive poll, why would you not do that? Why would you resist that? Why would you start in a different front, a lawsuit that would restrict the information, not that the federal government can ask for, but that states can ask for when they're signing people up or getting voter registrations? And yet such a lawsuit was commenced and was successful. These efforts have been successful. The integrity of US elections when it comes to these particular issues has been successfully degraded by lawsuits.
Well, you know, I hate to be Pollyannish about this. I think that's the phrase, but I think we should be prepared for an unhappy outcome on election day. Not because we'll be unhappy with the result, but because we won't get a result on election day. And that people will be questioning the outcome of the elections, both through litigation and frankly in Congress, which is ultimately is the decider who at least who wins the presidency by allowing or disallowing electors, that, you know, we may not know who won. Because of the chaos that's being invited into the system and the massive voter fraud potentially it's being invited into the system as a result of these last minute changes to our election law. And Judicial Watch is doing its best to assure that we have a fair and free election and that chaos is avoided. So I encourage those of you who are watching to support our cause. You can see from Bob, we've got this really expert approach to at least doing what we can within the law to protect cleaner elections. But as citizens, you need to be personally active as well, even beyond supporting Judicial Watch, as we were discussing today. And so we'll keep you apprised of this issue through the summer and up to and past the election, because this issue is going to go past the elections. It's not just about November 2020. It's about all elections. The question is, are we going to be able to decide who we want to be who we want to govern, or are we going to let fraud decide it? Are we going to let our votes be stolen or more easily stolen? And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, we're going to do our darndest to prevent that from happening and preserve our Republican form of government. With that, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this special report on Judicial Watch's efforts to ensure cleaner elections this year in 2020 and beyond.